And now I believe we're going to hear from, I think, the only person in the room who I've known longer than I've known Joseph Tabbi. Yeah, Eric and I went to undergraduate college together, co-college in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And our lives have had all these intermingling crawls. I won't go into too much detail about that incident on the quadrangle. But we've had so many interlocking paths, coincidences throughout the years since. And one of them was, I actually decided to move to Chicago when I was talking with Eric, decided to move to his neighborhood. But I think you made your acquaintance with Joe right about the same time. You were just finishing your master's degree and you decided to do a PhD with Joe. And then, of course, over many years, you worked with Joe on the electronic book review. And through, again, maybe an odd set of coincidences, we both ended up in Scandinavia at the same time. And then, of course, eventually, so did Joe. But anyway, Eric Rasmussen, Associate Professor of English at the University of Stavanger, who's known Joe for many, many years. Eric. And also, Joe, Eric's the only person who is legitimately a PhD supervisee of Joseph Tabbi in the room. Joe was just my opponent, but he was.
Yeah, thank you. And I have a few minor corrections even on that history, which is just like I started working on EBR first, and then Joe recruited me back into academia. I have an aside about that. We'll see if there's time. Anyway, so these are like tentative remarks for the Festschrift that'll appear in EBR later. Reading ecological realism and Joseph Tabbi's cognitive criticism. No, it's gonna be more informal than that. But looking back, an expanded sense of the possibilities of the literary ecology is what I've come to appreciate most by reading Tabbi's work, first encountered Joe in text, Tabbi's work, and collaborating with Joe as an editor at EBR, which I joined before going back into academia. So I hope my remarks today convey a sense of what I've learned about reading ecologically and participating in, building in, and being part of literary communities that are able to situate literature in a way that they make a medial difference. Okay, so reading literature matters, and so do the creative activities arising in active, vibrant, living literary environments. If literary criticism entails more than understanding implied meanings attributed to the sensibility of a single author, intentional readings, large-scale way in literary studies of still what you're doing, if literary criticism entails more than discerning features in a text symptomatic of its unacknowledged psychological and ideological tendencies, symptomatic readings, another large tendency in literary studies. If literary criticism is also to remain a genuine literary practice, one grounded in the imaginative act of reconfiguring worlds composed from words, an ordinary, everyday reading practice that begins to appear extraordinary when we reflect upon it, then it is crucial to pay attention to the raw matter from which literature's imaginary worlds are formed, namely letters, language, words. Criticism, Tabbi proposes, quote, would do well to shift from interpretation to observation, from a concern with the author's subjectivity to what is public and publishable and intersubjective, starting with the works itself. Observing is essential to the practice of literary criticism because deliberate, patient, empirically grounded observations about a work's materiality, not just what the composition records, registers, represents, and expresses, means, but as importantly, what it is composed from. Words, of course, but how these words are shaped in forms that enable recursive rereadings that, when written down in relatively fixed, stable forms and put into circulation can harness a work's truly generative creative potential. Quote here from Joe: "The critic's function when observing an author's recorded observations is not primarily to judge the work, produce its history, or even reflect on its meanings." Those are all important, and Joe's done them all in his scholarship. We all do it every day in our practice of teaching and writing about literature. Joe says a far more integral activity is to think with the work, to converse through it and explore social forms and possibilities at the level of the work's autopoiesis. It's coming to form. These citations are from Tabbi's Cognitive Fictions, 2002, one of the few books in the University of Minnesota Press's esteemed electronic mediation series tagged as literary studies, also digital culture, which features close readings of some then contemporary American novelists whose writing exemplifies a new mode of writing about the self that works self-consciously with narrative as an artistic medium. Published 7 years after Postmodern Sublime, Technology in American Writing from Mailer to Cyberpunk, and written during the period when EBR established itself as a networked journal, scrappy journal DIY, that was establishing itself within these institutional frameworks. Time-consuming business, but it had to be done. Cognitive Fictions, as I'll be framing it, offers a unique variety of narrative eco-criticism, one focused on the mental and medial ecologies in innovative works of print fiction, primarily novels, but other forms as well. The novel encompasses a lot. So despite its challenging theoretical framework, Cognitive Fictions remains the single author title by Tabbi I feel closest to, not least because I read the manuscript proofs of this many, many times, very attentively and closely. It features a post-humanist conceptual index that I designed and composed as part of my PhD training in American literature and literary theory at UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, with Joe. And Joe made sure that the Minnesota Press acknowledged my intellectual labor on the index page itself, compiled by. This was a big deal. I felt grateful when the narratologist David Herman heralded my contribution to the paratextual apparatus in the opening paragraph of his Simplique review. Paratexts matter more than ever as printed works that are carefully assembled, and I'm using the term work deliberately, carefully assembled, composed, edited, get disassembled, disaggregated, and too often disappear into unstable digital textual platforms that we all know are being taken over by anonymous corporate entities. So anyway, but I was thrilled just having, this was in print, my name in print in a paragraph in this review, connecting my name with Thomas Pynchon, first paragraph, Thomas Pynchon, Richard Powers, Paul Auster, David Markson, Harry Matthews, and Stephanie Strickland. Lynn Tillman was overlooked in Herman's list of the volume's cognitive fiction writers, but with Joe's support and encouragement, he encourages his students to write about writers who don't get the adequate attention that they deserve. With Joe's support, I would later on really pursue Tillman's writing extensively, and I'm grateful for the kind of introductions that you've given me. Like, you've got to read this, or I'd see it on in the bookshelves that you have at home. The minimalist ones are things you're thinking about, and then of course Joe was grateful enough. I was a PhD student supervising students in undergrad and so on. But he let me get out of the cubicle place they had for all the PhD students, and I was able to share his office, which had this magnificent library of book editions, some of which you'll see here. Things like that Joe's done. Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Ripper. You cursed me. So, anyway, Tillman, I'd later go on to contribute an essay about her novel No Lease on Life to a special on cognitive fictions at the American Book Review, and then later on write the first scholarly article about Tillman's masterpiece, American Genius, a comedy, a piece about how the novel, comprised of 155 lexias, expresses the affective dimension of embodied cognition. So, pardon my digressive personal aside, but I want to suggest how Joe brings students, colleagues, writers, artists. You can see where I wanted to affect. It's joy. Jouissance, I believe is the term, technical term. Pardon me. Serge will approve. Okay, so Joe brings others into networks of care. Networks of care. That's this term, our term here, the humanities thing, or actants and ecosystems that host collaborative communities. Though the neoliberal corporatization of education systems, a theme Joe foregrounds in his studies of William Gaddis's work, often overlook and devalue much collaborative cognitive labor. So I'm really grateful for the Center for Digital Narrative, this community and environment that's been built, the ELO, EBR. These are really important institutions that aren't just resisting, they actually are building an alternative culture in a way that's not just the marketing alternative. You know, when Alt-X was there when alternative meant something. An alternative to, you know, the whole idea that there is no society and so on. Pardon me. Mercy me, the ecology. So, moreover, as readers of Thomas Pinch and Lynn Tillman, William Gaddis know well, digressions, asides, meta-commentary can act as narrative catalysts. Indeed, enfolded together, they can cohere into a larger work itself, an assemblage, a cognitive assemblage that becomes more than the sum of its parts. In Tabbi's accounts, digressions enable narrators to make abrupt jumps in consciousness, akin to those made by the modular mind, that can eventually reveal unanticipated but significant connections when inscriptions of momentary thoughts are re-encountered and re-engaged in different environments by different minds, both actual readers and writers and fictive characters. All right, so I'm giving like lit crit glosses, forgive me here, but that's what I do. There are two critical conceptual moves underlying the ecological perspective proffered in cognitive fictions. Both build upon insights from German scholars, and Joe has done, you know, international scholar and no, I don't need to go into that digression now. But Friedrich Kittler's post-structuralist media theory and Niklas Luhmann's sociological systems theory, whose ideas also inform the work of two of Tabbi's closest US-based peers in American literary studies at the time, John Johnston at Emory University, who was the supervisor of my master's, and Carrie Wolf. I'm going to leave out the aside about their iteration thing. So the first eco-critical move in Joe's writing follows from the recognition that after 550 years, the Gutenberg era, the age of the printing press, is ending. The internet, accessed via the World Wide Web, is rapidly, mid-90s, consolidating its position as the predominant medium for the production, creation, distribution of not simply writing, but information. For some, many perhaps, this radical paradigm shift in medial ecology renders the codex novel an obsolete form, one destined for the dustbin of history, to be returned to pulp. In vulgar business terms, mass-produced content, data to be mined, extracted. But alert to the power of residual media forms, which not only remain in use, but can also be repurposed imaginatively in surprising ways, Tabbi hypothetically, quote, posits literature as a print-based system existing at the margins of the defining media of our time. Literature as a print-based system existing at the margins of a defining media of our time. So online then, literary writing is positioned to extend its readership, okay, but less obviously to amplify its intellectual, effective, expressive effects. Everything that literature does is wonderful through large-scale processes of distributed cognition in a networked medial ecology. So this is Luhmann's system and environment distinction deployed in the service of literary activism. The migration of print literature to these new digital, new media environments, electronic, digital, virtual, cyber, and so on, that can enable the discovery of potentials embedded within literary writing. Most significantly, the innovative atypical modes of thinking and ways of knowing registered in distinctive written formations, and he's particularly interested in narrative here. Quote, this marginality and medial difference far from putting the literary artist at a disadvantage, might allow the artist to resist the largely communicative purposes of other media, to manage their multiplicity and to experience the meaning of their unreflective functions. And this use of communication this is where Joe's drawing on Luhmann's system theory, which distinguishes communication, which occurs in non-human social systems that, technically speaking, are what are non or more than other than human technologies, and then perception, which occurs in psychic systems, the mind, which is the brain and its extended systems, set in our embodied minds. So that's one of Joe's moves in from Luhmann. Joe's other eco-critical move in cognitive fiction follows from his extensive engagement with, as opposed to an application of, theories about the modular mind from cognitive science. Not a subordination of literary knowledge, which emerges through shared critical reflections about artistic explorations, to knowledge from the natural sciences, which arises from controlled experimental investigations. So it's not a subordination of literary knowledge to scientific knowledge, natural sciences, and so on, but rather an attempt to discover significant correlations between different approaches to cognition. In everyday terms, how are the different ways of thinking? It entails discovering epistemological affinities between functionally differentiated disciplines and fields with necessarily different objects of studies of methodologies. Here's a great quote. "A mind is not a computer, but one thing that unites literature, computer science, and cognitive psychology is a new appreciation of the embodiment of each of these ways of knowing, down to the material substrate whose differentiations enable the emergence of higher level structures of meaning." So gradually what becomes perceptible through Tabbi's deliberate observations of literary works, sometimes sentence by sentence, line by line, or single words, is consciousness itself, or with less hyperbole and more precision, quote, "the fictive presentation of cognitive operations." By analyzing variations of a distinctive narrative motif, often moments where the narratorial descriptions reach a block, an impasse, or an aporia, it becomes possible to perceive habitual patterns of thinking in the writing that shapes the narrator's and other focalizers' sense of reality. These experiential reports of consciousness will always diverge to varying degrees from the reality experienced by other observers, both within and without the story world, whose thinking is formed and deformed by their interactions in a particular medial environments. And all of this inside and out, and who's a fictive presentation, who's an avatar, who's in the text, at what stage of their life are they? Are they within all of these kind of conceptual things you have to do to figure out reading a postmodern narrative. They end up being the same things that we're doing all the time when we're interfacing and trying to decide how when you meet people in person you haven't seen for years, you're encountering them in social media. It's the same kind of thinking that's going on. And it's really exciting to see the overlap here at the Center for Digital Narrative between what used to be considered to be extraordinary kind of quirky, weird, avant-garde, cutting-edge, postmodernist fiction. It actually is really part of the everyday. And that's part of one of the things I think that's great about Joe's approach, why I was distinguishing between intentional criticism, symptomatic criticism. Something is Joe brings back a sense of the ordinary. Even, he's doing it in theoretical terms here, but part of the sense of the ordinary and that becomes extraordinary through these reflections. So, I know there's not much time here. Let me go a little bit longer. Moment-by-moment operations in the narrative, in the literary mind, not as privileged representation of reality, but a means of registering experiences that emerge from a largely mediated environment, but seem to have little to do with what's happening precisely in that environment. And I have so much more to say, and I think in some ways it's better to bring it out conversationally. So I want to close with a close reading that Joe does from Lynn Tillman's short story, "To Find Words." And I'm violating all the things they say, well, could you just show the quote? No, it's too long, then you violate the cardinal rule of slides. There's too much text on the screen. But I want us to listen. That's one of the words that Joe brings out in his readings of Gaddett, listen. It's so important. So this is a little bit long, and I want Joe to have the final word. And it's this Joe doing close reading, and a particular kind of close reading. And close reading can mean a lot of things, but that Joe's kind of a patient listener, right? We've heard that in those testimonials. So here is he doing this, listening to Lynn Tillman's postmodernist story. Tillman's protagonist is a young author named improbably Paige Turner, who cannot pretend to believe in words and the power of stories, and so determines to write about writing itself. And again, this is all Joe here, with bits of Tillman, and I won't differentiate them. And that's one of the things I learned from Joe also, is the way he integrates citations into his writing. I think it's quite, it's wonderful. He's a fantastic literary critic, for those of you that read him, because he actually works with the authors a lot, and brings their words into the scholarship. And I love that about going back to his work. Her narrative alternates between third-person views of Paige, direct presentation of the literal pages in her notebook, and first-person commentaries by a narrator with access to Paige's thoughts. To herself, Paige defines her ambitions as an author in the barest material terms. Quote, to find words and place them in a certain order, syntax, unquote. That's what Paige thinks the sentences she goes on to write has to do with a syntax on U.S. liquor and cigarettes. It's even stronger here in Norway, we know that, right? This happens throughout the narrative, as the words found by the narrator are continually taken over and reappropriated by the character, and vice versa. The issue is the relation between the thought track that runs through every one of Tillman's essay narratives, whether presented as fiction or nonfiction, and the texts that her protagonists are working on, or, when the protagonists are non-writers, between the self and voices and human visitors who become phrases in the body. So I'm going to leave us with that, phrases in the body. Joe, you've left phrases in my body, in my mind, but more than just phrases, it's bits of, Joe loves annotations, and it's one of the things I've learned most as a teacher from him, is like, keep that running track. I do it with my students myself. Flag it, tag it, mark it up, take your text, right? This is the way that a creative way, and Joe has the archive here. This is part of like the practice here. And my final paragraph, which I'm not going to do, is actually a prompt, not for Scab GPT is what they're calling it UIC these days, Scab GPT. Scab GPT, not a prompt for that, but a prompt for students. And I also want to thank Joe. I've had the pleasure of Joe now examining not PhD students yet, I hope I have one, but master students of mine. And also he's willing to co-grade 100 level essays, from first year students here. He's not like, the elitist researcher who doesn't care about teaching. So thank you, Joe, for those kind of collaborations in so many different forms. I'm not going to tear up again. We'll save that for the cocktail hour. So thank you very much, Center for Digital Narratives, Scott and everybody. And thank you most of all to you, Joe. I love you.